I've received a letter from the honourable member for Greenway proposing that a definite matter of public importance be submitted to the House for discussion, namely the government's latest failures on the national broadband network. I call upon those honourable members who approve of the proposed discussion to rise in their places, and I call the honourable member for Greenway.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's no surprise that we see on the front pages today that in the minds of Australians they have completely lost confidence in the economic credentials of this Prime Minister and of this government, their ability to maintain our AAA credit rating, their ability to manage this economy. And it is instructive when it comes to the national broadband network. These constant self-proclaimed superior economic managers, so they said when it came to Australia's largest infrastructure project, but any semblance they may have had of any credibility has evaporated over the past week. We had the Prime Minister telling this chamber just last month that the NBN was one of the biggest corporate turnarounds in Australian history. Well, it turns out, Mr Speaker, that the only thing that has turned around is this government doing a massive backflip on its commitment to limit its equity stake in the NBN to $29.5 billion. What did they do on Friday? On Friday we bid a solemn farewell to what we on this side thought would be an ironclad promise, possibly the last promise standing from this government on the NBN, that their equity contribution due to run out on the 31st of December this year would be absolutely capped, and that there will be no more public funding going into this vehicle. And we believe this because they said it boldly, they said it confidently, they said it often. They even said it as recently as a few weeks ago. They declared for the past 3 years it would always be capped at $29.5 billion. Well, surprise, surprise, Mr Speaker, last Friday the government quietly announced a $19.5 billion loan to the NBN, $19.5 billion in taxpayers' money to help complete the rollout of its second-rate rubbish national broadband network. And we honestly on this side thought they would keep to this one promise, because we had it time and again. We had then Prime Minister Abbott in April 2013 announcing the coalition's policy on the NBN. Well, what we are going to do is we are going to invest the money up to the $29.5 billion. We had the then Minister for Communications, along with the minister here at the table, on the 13th of May 2014, again commit the government's investment is capped at $29.5 billion, with the balance of the project to be funded by the private sector. We had Senator Cormann in Senate estimates in May last year, when asked if the government was leaving open the possibility of more government equity for the NBN. His answer, no. The equity cap that is in place is 29.5, and our planning is for NBN to source the remaining funding requirements by raising debts from external markets. We believe and are confident that that will be able to be achieved. We had the current Minister for Communications only on the 13th of May this year. Well, the Commonwealth has indicated that our cap on equity contributions will be $29.5 billion. NBN will have to borrow beyond that, but $29.5 billion is the Commonwealth cap. We had the same in the NBN Corporate Plan 2017. It is expected that NBN will continue to be funded with Commonwealth equity up to $29.5 billion. We had the Strategic Review in 2013. Equity funding is capped at $29.5 billion. Well, have a look at this. Have a look at what we've got here, Mr Speaker. Absolutely consistent until last Friday. Until last Friday, when this government decided on some $20 billion of taxpayers' money to go back into the NBN. $20 billion. And now this government is trying to find excuses for its latest broken promise and put out a media statement saying that NBN's 2017 corporate plan assumes it will source private debt funding for the remaining $19.5 billion needed to complete the rollout. And here's the big excuse. A government loan on commercial terms represents the most cost-effective way to raise the debt and secure funding to complete the rollout of this important national infrastructure project. Well, it's no news, Mr Speaker, no news that of course a government rate is always lower. But but it goes to the incompetence of this government, the utter incompetence and inability to manage this project, the last remaining promise that they had on the NBN that was standing. We didn't even think they were going to break it. They surprised even us. It is so unequivocal, Mr Speaker. These promises are still on the Prime Minister's website today. Go to the Prime Minister's website today. He's got his coalition broadband policy FAQs, and he says, this is the Prime Minister, public funding of $29.5 billion will be required for a coalition NBN. Full stop. No equivocation. No equivocation whatsoever. It goes on. Labor currently claims funding of $44.1 billion will be required to complete its NBN. Well, even if that is the case, Mr Speaker, the people of Australia would be getting a real NBN for less money than what this government is doing. And it goes on. This is really good. These are the words of the Prime Minister. There is no free lunch. If capital is tied up in the NBN, then it has to be paid for, either by taxpayers or consumers or both. Less funding is needed under the Commonwealth Plan. Well, not less funding if this government's just tipped $20 billion of taxpayer funding into it. But here's the special that I love that's still on the Prime Minister's website. Our goal is to ensure all Australians have very fast broadband by 2016 and that everybody can access at least 25 megabits per second. Well, Mr Speaker, 39 days to go. Only about 7 million premises, and I've done the maths. We only need 180,000 premises a day to be connected. Why is this minister sitting here? He should be out there. He should be out there with the pliers in the node. Everyone needs to chip in, Mr Speaker. And I note even SBS Online comments in its article from yesterday. NBN a growing worry for federal budget. And I quote, concerns are mounting that Australia's broadband network will leave an anchor on the country's budget. And it quotes, the new $20 billion loan is an unanticipated commitment from the government. Malcolm Turnbull had previously indicated that the organisation would be able to operate without assistance from the government with only the initial funding. Well, we now know that to be completely and utterly wrong, Mr Speaker. And on that point, well, where is the minister? Where is the minister in all of this? Well, unfortunately, the minister woke up yesterday to an editorial in The Australian, of all things, stating the end-of-year awards season is almost here, but there's already an odds-on favourite for the title of the most ineffective politician in the land. Take a bow, Mitch Fifield, the Homer Simpson of the Turnbull government. Well, I will not have Homer Simpson talked about in those terms, Mr Speaker. And quite frankly, when you have a minister like this, it is no surprise, and I know my colleagues contributing to the debate will back this up with the real-world experiences of our constituents, as we have seen in the telecommunication industry ombudsman's most recent figures that came out last week. And when you look at the top 10 postcodes for NBN complaints, here time and time again in this chamber, we even had the minister sitting at the table take a question from the member for Robertson on the 12th of September asking about the rollout of the NBN on the Central Coast. And he said, the Turnbull government is delivering when it comes to the NBN. What they are delivering on the Central Coast is amongst the top 4 postcodes for complaints on the Central Coast. Toukley, Wyong, Central Coast, Gosford, all of these areas recording the highest numbers of complaints. And where overall are the highest numbers of complaints? In rural and regional areas, being utterly let down by this government. And we have the front page from the Newsmail in Bundaberg. Bundy tops the nation for NBN complaints. Bundaberg tops the nation. And what is the coincidence that's going on here? Amazingly, these are predominantly areas where fibre-to-the-node copper-based technology has been rolled out. If you wanted any example, any evidence of why this government is so hopeless at delivery for the consumers of Australia, here it is in the TIO's own figures. Complaints have gone up by something like 150% in some cases. for faults and for consumers failing to get the product that they paid for. So, Mr Speaker, we see quite clearly how much this government has let down the people of Australia, how hopeless they have been in terms of the economic management of the project. And on top of all that, we have recently seen Australia ranked 23rd out of 26 countries when it comes to broadband satisfaction. This government has utterly failed the people of Australia on every single count with the NBN. Sooner, faster, more affordable. It has been fail from this government every step of the way.
I call the Minister for Urban Infrastructure.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Well, here we go again, yet again the Shadow Minister maintaining the tradition of being a Labor Shadow Minister for Communications, of continuing to assert, in the face of the gathering evidence that the rollout is going badly, when the light of broadband availability is spreading across the land, it falls to the Labor Shadow Minister to look for gloom. Let's remind ourselves of Labor's history of trying to claim in the parliament something that was quite at odds with the reality. And their preferred tool for doing that is a matter of public importance debate, because on the 17th of September 2015, the then member for Blaxland, or the member for Blaxland who was then the Shadow Minister, brought forward the topic, the Prime Minister's mismanagement of the National Broadband Network. At that point, 1,291,635 Australians able to connect. He was at it again on the 21st of October 2015, the Prime Minister's second-rate NBN. By that time, the number able to connect had risen to 1,374,408. By the 10th of February this year, he tried again. The Prime Minister is failing Australians with his second-rate NBN. Of course, the numbers continue to show an inexorable rise in the number of people who could be connected. By that point, 1,719,122 on the 3rd of May. On the 3rd of May, remarkably on Budget Day, Labor chose to raise the NBN as their brilliant wheeze as a topic for the matter of public importance debate, and then it was the government's failure to deliver on the NBN for Australians. By that time, the numbers had risen to 2,428,606. So we see, as Labor continues to insistently deny reality, what is happening is that the numbers of people who can connect are rising steadily, strongly, inexorably, due to the fact that we have a competent government competently delivering the rollout of this complex infrastructure project. Now, the member for Blaxland was delighted, I am sure, to finally be relieved of this smelly dead cat of a portfolio and to hand it to the member for Greenway. And she's been continuing to try and assert in some Stalinist fashion the alternative reality, at odds with the truth, at odds with what is actually happening, because by the 11th of October, Mr Deputy Speaker, the number of premises that connect had risen to 3,207,727. So that inexorable, relentless, continuing rise in the number of people who can get the national broadband network has been continuing, even while the member opposite, the Shadow Minister, has been trying desperately to assert that reality is at odds with what the numbers, what the reality, what the empirical observations tell us. And today she's at it again, untroubled by the empirical evidence. She doesn't mind. She's not interested in what the numbers say. She's going to blind herself to that. She's going to turn a blind eye to that, and she's going to put forward the proposition, quotes, the government's latest failures on the NBN as the number of premises which can connect is now standing at 3,426,350. Mr Deputy Speaker, we can only conclude that there is some kind of Labor Shadow Communication Minister version of the prayer which is the opposite of the prayer of St Francis of Assisi. Where there is light, let me look for darkness. Where there is progress, let me assert problems. Where there is a network being rolled out with the numbers steadily and relentlessly increasing, let me, in an increasingly desperate and frankly somewhat unhinged way, assert the existence of an alternative reality. Let me clutch at the day-to-day vagaries of a massive project and claim that they show to quote from her media release, quotes, "The government is in absolute disarray," close quotes. The position, Mr Deputy Speaker, is absolutely the opposite of that. We are seeing a steady, relentless, continuing increase in the number of people who can connect. Those numbers are reported on the company's website every week, and the company is on track. It has repeatedly said that it is on track, and its performance is backing up what it is saying, that by the end of June 2017, half of all premises, 5.4 million, will be able to access the NBN. It will be 3/4 of all premises in Australia by the end of June 2018, and that builds on a steady increase in the number of premises. By the middle of 2014, 604,000. By the middle of 2015, 1,165,000. By the middle of 2016, 2,893,000. And now, Mr Deputy Speaker, as I've recently informed the House, 3,426,350 premises now able to access the national broadband network. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, the claims of the Labor Party would be absurd even if they started with a blank slate. But we know they do not. The Labor Party, when it comes to the national broadband network, starts with a record of delivery. That is one of the great displays of policy and execution incompetence in the history of the Commonwealth. The rank ineptitude of the other side of this House when it comes to the question of the national broadband network will still be studied in case studies in schools of business and government in 20, 30 or 50 years' time. Let us not forget, Mr Deputy Speaker, that what Labor proposed in the 2007 election was there was going to be a national broadband network. It was going to be a 12 megabit per second network. It was going to deliver fibre to the node to 98% of premises. It was going to cost $4.7 billion, $4.7 billion, and the private sector was going to pay for half of it. What happened, Mr Deputy Speaker? None of that got delivered. None of that got delivered. In a display of rank ineptitude, they managed to completely fail to hold a competitive selection process, and in 2009 they were forced to admit they couldn't do it. So then we had a new plan, the $43 billion fibre to the premises model, which was announced in a lather of excitement, and of course we were told the private sector was still going to invest. Don't worry, the private sector is still going to invest in the national broadband network. And guess what? That didn't happen. The implementation study, which was dropped out in the dead of night in May 2010, disclosed that the private sector advisors to the then Labor government, KPMG and McKinsey, said the private sector is not going to touch this with a barge pole, and guess what? It turned out to be 100% government funded. And now it turns out that these geniuses in corporate finance, Mr Deputy Speaker, these geniuses presume to come in and lecture to this government about the financing structure of the national broadband network. What an extraordinary proposition after their rank display of incompetence and ineptitude over the 6 years in which they were in government. Let's not forget that then Prime Minister Rudd urged Australian mum and dads to invest through Australian infrastructure bonds. That didn't happen either, and we should be very relieved that it didn't, because that would have been a spectacularly poor piece of financial advice. So this Labor opposition's track record when it comes to corporate finance, when it comes to the finance structure underpinning the national broadband network, is a track record that any rational person would be acutely embarrassed by, and you certainly wouldn't be returning to the topic in some Pavlovian fashion week after week, month after month, as if you wanted to remind the Australian people of the gross display of incompetence and lack of credibility on this topic that manifests when it comes to the Labor Party and the national broadband network. And now the Shadow Minister is in a lather of indignation, because what we have said is that in addition to the cap of $29.5 billion on equity funding from the taxpayer into the national broadband network, we have also said that there will be debt finance. We've consistently said there will be debt finance. As the company said just last week, it was very encouraged by the indicative credit ratings that it received from the credit agencies, and we are, of course, confident, as the Minister for Finance said, that yes, we could have raised private sector debt, but what we've chosen to do at this stage is raise the debt from the government. Why? Because it is cheaper. A very simple reason: it saves money for taxpayers. This is a financing strategy which saves money for taxpayers, but this debt This debt will be assumed by the private sector within a few years, and this is a rational, cost-effective strategy to maximise the best outcome when it comes to the national broadband network. And the proposition that the Labor Party, which delivered such a spectacularly inept display, which skulked out of government with barely 50,000 people connected to the national broadband network, the proposition that they should presume to lecture to this government, the proposition that they should be sufficiently irrational as even to raise this topic is frankly quite extraordinary. You've got a clear contrast. On this side of the House, you've got a government which is systematically, steadily rolling out the national broadband network, this complex project which we inherited in absolute disarray. On the other side of the House, you have a party which has a hopeless track record on delivery. When it comes to NBN, they've got a lot to be ashamed of when it comes to this topic.
I call the member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Let me say from the start, I am a huge fan of high-speed broadband. And until some months ago, I would probably still have said I'm a huge fan of the NBN. It has the capacity to be a transforming technology for the economy in my seat of Macquarie. Certainly, where we have fibre to the premises, we're seeing some great stories. But in the last few months, the experiences of the rollout of NBN in my electorate make me despair for what might have been. I have to say I am thrilled that the government has failed to achieve its targets of delivering NBN by the end of 2016, because it gives me some hope that the massive areas in my electorate that are not getting this second-rate fibre to the node system might sometime in the future be entitled to a decent rollout. I hope that the other side sees our sense that fibre to the premise is the way to go. However, we are getting fibre to the node in the Upper Blue Mountains. Last week, around 200 people joined me for a forum in Wentworth Falls. I made it clear to that audience that I didn't think that fibre to the node was going to really achieve the things we wanted. However, I did say we need to try and make the best of a bad bunch, and that's what we tried to do. To be fair, not everybody at the forum had had a bad experience with connecting or running NBN. But they were the minority. People don't come out on a Thursday night to talk about an issue like NBN unless they are really driven. And I've got to tell you, a lot of people in that room, they were driven. We were overflowing. We had to put extra seats out. I've never seen people as angry about an issue. So, look, I do also want to acknowledge that I managed to get not just angry people in a room, but I did have NBN representatives. I also had Telstra representatives in the room, because one of the biggest issues my office finds is that NBN blames a service provider, usually Telstra, and Telstra blames NBN. So I think having them both in the room was a good start. However, in my view, the test of an organisation and a government is not how you deal with an issue when it's going well. It's how you deal with an issue when it's not going well. And I have to say I'm unimpressed with the NBN co-response to many of my constituents. I didn't really know why they would respond that way until I saw the member for Bradfield, who seems to have no interest in the challenges that people are having, the hours they're spending on the phone trying to get solutions. But now I can see that this is a top-down approach. Let me talk a little bit about the frustration that my community is feeling. There are houses in one street where one's been connected and the neighbour hasn't. No one can really work out what the problem is. North Katoomba seems to be simply plonked in the too hard basket. People have had weeks without a phone or connection in the switchover period, and again, no one can really explain why. Slow speeds are an ongoing issue. Bob Payton from Lura suffered this, and again, no one really seems to be able to identify if it's the NBN or the RSP. And dropouts. Can I tell you about dropouts? Michelle McKenzie, who works for a financial services firm, told me that in getting connected it took 3 days. They lost hours and hours. Their business pretty much had to grind to a halt. By day 3 of the saga, she was getting frustrated, and here's a bit of insight into how well our community is being serviced. In one conversation, the NBN guy, and I'm quoting Michelle, suggested I walk to the nearest Optus shop and grab a dongle so that she could have internet connection. Here's her response: walk to the nearest Optus shop and grab a dongle. We're in Katoomba, and the nearest Optus shop is 50 kilometres away in Penrith. She does confess that was the moment she lost her temper. And I think that's what this government does not appreciate, that it is pushing people who are having a bad customer experience, a bad technical experience, and no sense that anyone actually cares about their problems. This is just one of the examples that we're seeing. We also have issues around the wireless rollout and Sky Muster. One of the things I think this government has done is redefine community consultation. I think they believe it means you make a decision and then you tell the community. That's the way our community is being treated. There is no respect. It isn't good enough, and like everything this government touches, they know how to take a visionary idea and they know how to destroy it.
I call the Assistant Minister for Rural Health.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Speaking about the NBN is such a pleasure, because we have just heard a diatribe of people who've had problems. When you look at a system that is being beset with poor planning and on the back of a coaster concepts from the previous government, I find it grossly hypocritical that they are now complaining about a system that they delivered to the nation. Look, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. Just look at the record of what was achieved in the 6 years of the previous Gillard-Rudd government. It started off, as I said, on the back of a coaster on a plane, and it was going to be $4.4 billion. 6 years later, more than $6 billion, less than 1% of their projected rollout having happened. Contractors, in fact whole states where the rollout was meant to be happening, going broke. Rip-offs of contractors and subcontractors, a whole board with very few people with communication skill, a lot of political appointments rather than technocrats, and pop-up contractors with whole states with nothing, absolutely nothing to show for 6 years of work. Their own model they had to change to fibre to the premise. We changed that model because things change. Also, $4,400 per connection for fibre to the premise, whereas fibre to the node is $2.8K. A lot of the big contractors in the US and Europe are now using, surprise, surprise, fibre to the node with VDSL2 and vectoring, delivering speeds of the magical 100 megabytes per second, which in your previous model you were going to spend almost twice as much delivering. It was going to be $30 billion more and 6 to 8 years longer. Now, the member for Greenaway criticised the change in financing, but it's actually not a change. There's $29.5 billion of government equity in it, which was always the plan, and there was another $20 billion from debt financing. And as the member for Bradfield just pointed out, equity is different from debt financing. Debt means the NBN will be paying interest and repaying the capital over time. And if any business can get cheaper capital, cheaper borrowing costs, obviously it's a good idea, and a government can get capital at a lot cheaper rate than going out to the markets. Now, you only have to look at what's been delivered now in the 4 years of the coalition running out the NBN, which we inherited from the other side. We have increased exponentially the number of people that can now be potentially attached to the NBN. In fact, it's 3.4 million premises that can be connected now. At the end of the Labor government in 2013, there was the princely sum of 51,000 people across the country versus 3.4 million now. You only got to look in my electorate of Lyne. In September 2013, there were 1,000 people, just over 1,000 people with an active connection. Now it's available to 35,216 premises. Wireless rollout across the line electorate is now available to 12,695. It was less than 1,000 then. And there are 29,000 more under construction in just my electorate alone. The old interim satellite, that underpowered and overloaded system that was so frustrating, was available to 500 people who are all pulling their hair out. And now the Sky Muster has 7,000 people in the line electorate that are eligible. 50,000 paying customers in 2013 versus 1.5 million now. You've only got to look at the record. In rural and regional Australia, for instance, there has been a massive spend on internet capability. $2.6 billion in rural and regional Australia on the fixed wireless network, $2 billion on the satellite network. That means hundreds of people in remote Australia are now hooking up with 50 gigabytes available for education purposes, speeds of 25 megabytes per second download and 5 megabytes up.
The member's time has expired.
Much better.
I call the member for Wills.
Deputy Speaker, and I thank the member for Greenway for raising this matter of public importance because, in fact, in my seat of Wills, my electorate of Wills, it's almost a microcosm of Australia. The staggering failures of this government in rolling out the NBN are so pronounced and have affected so many people. Now, the member for Lyne said that the NBN started out on the back of a coaster on a plane. Well, this government's online policy framework wouldn't take up a drink coaster. Labor comes up with the ideas and this government destroys them. So I just want to, when I say it's a microcosm of Wills, in the southern part of my electorate of Wills, residents enjoy the economic, social, educational and entertainment benefits of the world-class fibre-to-the-premise connectivity that was installed, that was rolled out under the previous Labor government. And in fact, I'm lucky to be one of those residents. I live in the suburb of Brunswick, which had fibre-to-the-premises, fibre-to-the-home rolled out before the coalition took government. Just north of my street, however, residents are cursed with Malcolm's mess, the Prime Minister's mess, a shoddy, third-rate internet in an age where businesses and residents are increasingly reliant on internet connectivity.
I will remind the member of Wills to use his members by their correct title, and this will be the last warning I'll give on that.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister's mess. And let's be very clear about this. A broadband connection in 2016 is not merely a luxury item, but rather it is an essential utility. I rose in this place recently on October the 12th to speak about how shocked and disappointed I was to discover that the scheduled rollout of the NBN to the suburbs of Pascoe Vale, Glenroy, Fawkner, Gowanbray, Hatfield and Coburg was sneakily cancelled by this government. That's right, Mr Deputy Speaker. It was just quietly disappeared from the NBN website, but many residents noticed. They actually go on, even though they might be on ADSL, they actually go on and have a look at that website because they're anticipating a rollout into their suburbs. And I regularly hear complaints from constituents in those northern suburbs in Melbourne about the quality of their internet connection being so poor. And that same week that my constituents were reeling from the disappointment of their long-awaited upgrade being pulled from under them, the Prime Minister proclaimed on October 11 that the Coalition's NBN was, and I quote, one of the great corporate turnarounds in Australia's history. I'm astounded by that comment, Mr Deputy Speaker, especially in light of what was occurring in my electorate that very same week. But he was right. The Prime Minister was right, Mr Deputy Speaker. He did turn around from a world-class fibre to the premises NBN delivered by a Labor government to the Prime Minister's mess. The debacle in Wills is not unique. There is a litany of government failures on the NBN since they've taken control. And the Coalition promised Australia their version of the NBN was for $29.5 billion. And apart from the technological inferiority of fibre-to-the-curb or fibre-to-the-node solution that they have presented to Australians, it's now apparent that the cost of their already technologically crippled NBN has blown out to at least $54 billion, from $29.5 billion. The Telecommunication Industry Ombudsman has also reported that complaints about faults on NBN services have jumped by 147% under the Coalition's stewardship of the NBN. Complaints about slow internet speeds have soared by 48%. For a service which is supposed to improve internet service for Australians, this is a catastrophic failure by the government. And I'm sure we all remember Mr Turnbull's promise to provide every Australian household with access to the NBN by the end of 2016. Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, he has 39 days left. The Prime Minister has 39 days left to meet this promise. 39 days, and almost 8 million Australian households are still waiting for any upgrade to their homes and to the fibre to their homes. Many of those households and businesses are in my electorate of Wills, and I know from many of the speakers we've heard today, this is replicated right across Australia. So many people are frustrated, angry and upset that they are being dudded. So I ask Mr Deputy Speaker, what does the Prime Minister have to say to all these people? What does he have to say to them? To all the people of Wills and all the people across Australia, what has the Prime Minister to say about dudding them with his fizzer of a policy?
I call the member for O'Connor.
Deputy Speaker, and it's a real pleasure today to be able to talk on this MPI. And I had the pleasure last week of addressing an MPI from the Shadow Minister for Agriculture, and to have an MPI today from the Shadow Minister for Communications is a sort of surely their two most complete failures, policy failures, when they're in government. But if I want to bring a regional perspective to this issue today, Mr Deputy Speaker. And we've heard about people in the suburbs who currently have ADSL2, have a reasonable internet connection, but of course people living in regional areas don't have that. And I live that experience. I rely on mobile data for my internet connection at my house. It's intermittent. It's very poor. I'm very excited about the interim satellite, the satellite service, which I'll come to in a moment. But let's talk about Labor's record. I mean, they've been very critical of the government here today, but let's have a look at what Labor delivered. Starting back when then Prime Minister Rudd and Minister Conroy concocted the NBN on the back of a beer coaster, I believe, on an aeroplane on the way to Darwin. Remember, it was going to cost $4 billion, or $4.4 billion was the original estimate. So I think we've obviously come a long way from there. There's been a lot of developments in this space. But when I became a member of Parliament in September 2013, the number of people that had access to the NBN was 50,000 people, or just slightly over 50,000 people. That was what the Labor government had achieved in this space in that time. In my electorate of O'Connor, I might be wrong, I may well be wrong, and I will come and correct the record, but there wasn't one person connected to the NBN. Other than, and I will make the point that the interim satellite service was available to some people in my electorate, and what a disaster that was. One of my first experiences as a member of Parliament was being deluged with complaints about the poor service that people were receiving on the interim satellite service. Slower than dial-up, expensive, unreliable. And why was that? It was because the previous government had purchased a certain amount of capacity on the interim satellite. That capacity was swamped in no time flat. As you're nodding your head, Deputy Speaker, you understand this very well. And the speed of that service slowed down to less than dial-up. Now, for people like myself who would have liked to have had access to a satellite service, we couldn't join that satellite service. It was oversubscribed, and so we didn't have access to that service. And of course, what had happened in the meantime, once the previous government had announced the NBN plan, not 1 cent of private capital has been invested in this space. There was not one private operator that was out there offering an alternative service. So let's have a look at the government's record. We've had some criticism of the government today, but let's have a look at what we've achieved since 2013, September 2013, mainly by then Minister for Communications Malcolm Turnbull, now Prime Minister, and a fantastic record in business and understands communications and business probably better than anybody else in this place. So, in the 3 years that we've since we took government, we've passed 3.5 million homes. 3.5 million homes, Deputy Speaker, are now in a position to connect to the NBN. By the 30th of June 2017, not just over 6 months' time, there will be 5.4 million homes that will be able to connect to the NBN. Now, we've heard a lot of criticism about the speed, that everyone's not getting 100 megabits per second. Well, let's have a look at what people who are joining the service at the moment are actually choosing to do. Only 1 in 5 people are opting for a speed greater than 25 megabits per second. Only 1 in 5 people. Now, if you look at what the opposition are proposing, which is the fibre to the premises model, at an additional cost of $2,200 per connection, so that everybody gets 100 megabits per second. Not that everyone wants 100 megabits per second. That's borne out by the commercial reality that people are quite happy with up to 25 megabits per second. But for 11 million homes, at an extra $2,200 per home, that is $22 billion in extra expenditure to deliver that service that most people don't actually want. Most people don't actually want it. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, one of the major successes of the government in my electorate has been, of course, the launch of the satellite, which is providing a fantastic service to the 2,200 customers across my electorate that will no doubt choose to take up that service.
I call the member for Braddon.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Now, all I can say about the NBN, one of my favourite topics, is that under this coalition government, it's nothing but a national travesty, completely a national travesty, and you should come to Tasmania and see what has happened in that state. I mean, would you buy something that is of an inferior quality that would cost more and you'd probably take longer for it to be delivered? I mean, seriously, this is what you're proposing or what you have been putting in place under your fibre to the node plan. Now, as a Tasmanian, I was very proud in about 2009 when Tasmania was to be the first state to roll out full fibre to the premise NBN. Now, stage 1 was completed a year after its construction, and that was a backbone. That was a huge undertaking for Tasmania to construct a backbone and connect people, and they were connected a year after that construction commenced. We're now in stage 3, and now we have cities in my electorate of Burnie and Devonport that have not been connected to fibre to the node, other than a tiny little section of my city, tiny little section that has just got a couple of nodes built. Absolutely ridiculous, that's all I can say. And businesses and industry tell me all the time in those cities that they are absolutely so gutted by this government that when you're talking about jobs and growth, that there is not the infrastructure there to support them, and they have been dudded by the then minister who decided, oh, we'll change this to fibre to the node, a technology that is not future-proofed and will not meet the needs of Australians. But apart from that, the inequity of this rollout in my electorate, when you've got some sections that under Labor's plan have been connected full fibre to the premise, which is fantastic, and in the major population centres where they'll get fibre to the node. So you just got to look about the inequity. And you talk about a government that supports regions. Sorry, you're not supporting regional Tasmania at all. But the most ridiculous thing is that the coalition went to the 2013 election with a document that said the coalition's economic growth plan for Tasmania in August 2013, and it said the rollout of the NBN under the coalition will be complete in Tasmania by the end of 2015. 15. We're not looking now for Tasmania to be connected to the NBN until about 2018. Perhaps. Question mark. Is that when it's going to be complete? Who would know? And then you've got to look at the west coast of Tasmania. Under Labor, they were going to get full fibre to the premise, and Strawn was going to get fixed wireless. Then the then minister came in and said, no, first of all he said, oh, we'll honour all contracts before the election, and then said, no, now you're getting fibre to the node. But then, alas, they changed it and put the west coast of Tasmania on a satellite. Now, the satellite's great for small little hamlets, but when you've got 4,000 homes on the west coast of Tasmania that has high rainfall, has terrain that is mountainous, the community there knew it wasn't going to work. They then went to the local member at the time, the Liberal member for Braddon at the time, absolutely disgusted with what was going to happen for them. And he said, this represents a great opportunity and you should stop pining for a fibre to the premise instead. Well, he's gone. He's saying, sign up, find out what it's like, and if it's still a problem, let's talk about it. Then with all the community, I went to a a forum with the community with the then Shadow Minister, the member for Blaxland, and I tell you what, I'm surprised that that federal member got out of there alive. But then they did another backflip and said, oh, now we're going to put you on fibre to the node, which is great improvement from the satellite for them. And we've got one of the local members for Brad in the state parliament, and she says, wow, you're now getting what you deserve. It's a second-rate system for a population that is experiencing some really difficult and challenging economic hardships, with mine closure, with an economy that is depressed, that needs this type of technology now into the future so they can diversify, that they can grow jobs, that they can grow their local economy. And all this government has done is let the people of regional Tasmania down, and they should be condemned for that.
Yeah. I call the Chief Government Whip.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I heard an interesting word in the previous speaker's presentation, and it was a word called deserve. And it was a word that I could use quite strongly when I look at Labor clearly believed, when it was in government, that WA did not deserve any NBN. When Labor left WA, it left WA completely stranded in 2013, only managing to connect 109 existing homes during 4 years in charge of the NBN. 109. So that's all WA deserved, according to the Labor government. In fact, the NBN project was in such a shocking mess, like everything else that we inherited in 2013, that the construction contractors in Western Australia refused to continue building. That's how much of a mess you left, the Labor government left. The company contracted to build the NBN in WA and South Australia actually handed back 47 sites in Western Australia in 2013, which Labor had deceptively listed as under construction. So Labor has a very long record of broken promises on the NBN, and their really empty criticisms ignore the amazing progress the coalition has made in getting this failing project back on track. When contractors were handing back and stopping work, I wouldn't call that success. Today, the NBN network covers more than 343,000 WA addresses. What did we have back when Labor? Oh, 109. Now we have 343,000 WA addresses, and there are over 137,000 residents and businesses connected and enjoying the benefits of better broadband. And in my electorate, Mr Deputy Speaker, 2 weeks ago, we were actually able to celebrate the switching on of the final NBN node in central Bunbury. This wasn't even on Labor's map. Not even, it was on a map perhaps of 10 years or whenever. And the Bunbury Town Centre can now service over 2,200 premises with fibre to the node, and joins around 24,000 premises in the Greater Bunbury area that now have the same access. And this has employed local people, Mr Deputy Speaker. When I get out on the ground and talk to the contractors, there are so many local people involved. There's locally employed people. It was a seriously underserviced area, totally ignored by the Labor government. We weren't even on their maps. And the South West is very well advanced now with the NBN rollout. This is such an innovative and creative hub, and this has been absolutely prioritised by the coalition government. And I just see it's great to see the South West actually embracing the technology. To support this, a group of combining the Regional Development Australia South West, Business South West, South West Chambers of Commerce and the South West Development Commission have appointed an NBN advisor for the region. And Mike Hendry has been tasked with arming South West people and businesses with the very best information about their NBN options and opportunities so that they can actually make the right decisions for them, their family and their business. Unlike what we saw was a Labor's pie-in-the-sky proposal, we in the South West were looking at construction at least a decade away. Instead, my region today is seeing towers go up and boxes being built on street corners. Of the 62,000 or so premises on the NBN rollout plan, there are currently some 35,000 premises in Forest that have access to the NBN. And of course, this is great news in my part of the world, Mr Deputy Speaker, knowing that we were at least 10 years away under a Labor government. We now have access to the NBN. And of course we all know that Labor was overbuilding in areas where there was already significant NBN access, and certainly not prioritising underserviced rural and regional areas, Mr Deputy Speaker. And of course there are businesses and individuals, and they come along to a small business gathering. They learn what is the right access for their own business, what do they actually need, and that's what they're actually accessing. And these one-to-one gatherings are really useful for people, Mr Deputy Speaker, but I'm particularly proud that the NBN is in the southwest.
I call a member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'm glad that the issue of small business was raised, because that's certainly one that I'd like to come back to. It's extraordinary that we have a Prime Minister, Deputy Speaker, who talks a lot about being an agile, innovative economy, but the one thing he's never invested properly into is a first-rate fibre-to-the-premise NBN, the kind of NBN that this nation actually needs. Because whilst members opposite have alluded to some alleged favouritism of where NBN was allegedly being built into areas that were already over-serviced or well-serviced perhaps, I'd like to give the House some examples from Newcastle. Newcastle was a priority area for Labor, as it should be, but it was also a priority area for this government. Under Labor's plan, of course, every home and every business in Newcastle was to get fibre to the premise within 3 years. Would have already been done and dusted by now. Here we are, 2016, and what is the experience of the government's prioritising? We were in a priority rollout area, this government said. Well, in addition to initially having removed vast areas of Newcastle from the so-called priority rollout, which we had to scramble to get back included on the NBN rollout, the experience of people in Newcastle has been illuminating, to say the least. For those opposite who like to purport to be champions of small business in this place, like to suggest that people on this side of the House don't understand small business, we don't understand what they're going through, I'd like to talk a little bit today about Mel and Gordon Allerton, the owners of a small business in Newcastle, in the suburb of Islington, an inner-city area of Newcastle. The owners of Opposite Lock. It's an auto accessories place. Most of their business is not walk-in. Most of their business is, in fact, done through online and telephone contact. They have a thriving, well, they had a thriving business. Regretfully, in the last 15 months, they have suffered 66 days of outages. 66 days in which they cannot trade, have lost tens of thousands of dollars. They're not even, the great irony is they're not even actually trying to connect to the NBN at this point. This is just the fact that the old copper pit happens to be positioned out the front of their business, which is the point of access, the node which everybody else who's trying to connect to the NBN is having to get into and connect. Technicians from whether it's Optus, Telstra or the NBN code, no one actually wants to claim responsibility for most of the outages and stuff-ups in this particular case. But regardless of who attempts to try and resolve this issue, invariably, when you think you've got a fix, it actually turns out that it creates another problem 2 doors down or around the track. And it's because this is a shonky, second-rate NBN piece of infrastructure that this government is now relying on in order to allegedly deliver the needs not only of now but allegedly of the future generations of Australian men and women. It's crazy. Let me also talk to you just briefly about some residential areas, brand new greenfield builds into areas that are already NBN ready, allegedly. So we're not talking about places under construction, we're not talking about places maybe sometime in the future. These are NBN ready areas, brand new apartments being built, allegedly be able to hook up onto the NBN. 6 months I have been working with a constituent to get the NBN connected to his brand new apartment. 6 months. And when it finally happened, they managed to completely stuff it up again, and he ended up paying for his own electrical contractor at the end of the day to ensure that the connection was made properly. That's another example. Let me just give you a final example, Mr Deputy Speaker, and that is in another residential area in the west of my electorate, out in Fletcher. New housing development, lots of young, professional young families moving into the area. Stages 1 to 4 of the development, they're getting fibre to the node. Stages 5 to onwards will get fibre to the premise. This is within a very tiny geographical area. This is your classic digital divide that Labor warned this government of. Yes. Under Labor's plan, there were no losers. We don't back winners and losers, but you guys over there, members opposite, you're creating winners and losers everywhere.
Order. I call the member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm glad to speak today on the Coalition's rollout of the national broadband network that is being done efficiently and affordably, with all Australian premises to be connected by 2020. Under the Coalition, the NBN is connecting more active users every month than Labor connected during its entire time in government. Under the Coalition, the NBN has hit every rollout target we've set since coming into government. It is a fact that NBN is now available to more than 1 in 4 Australian premises, or more than 3.4 million premises with more than 1.5 million active connections. In my own electorate of Fisher, the rollout of the NBN is gathering pace, with more than 3,000 premises recently connected and ready for service in Wirtulla. Feedback from locals I've spoken to is that the latest work is already delivering faster and more reliable internet access through fibre to the node connections. As at 28 October, there were 30,694 homes and businesses ready for service in Fisher, and of these 11,250 had an active NBN connection. A further 11,237 homes and businesses are currently being rolled out. In October 2015, NBN Co released its 3-year rollout plan, which forecast that by the end of September 2018, approximately 66,160 homes and businesses in Fisher will either be ready for service or under construction. Mr Deputy Speaker, having spoken to some local business owners in recent weeks about their NBN connection, including the owner of Wirtulla news agency Gavin Yarrow, the arrival of the NBN has made their businesses more efficient. Gavin does a lot of daily downloads for invoicing and magazine subscriptions, which used to take him and his staff up to an hour. Now he tells me that the same task is completed in just a few minutes. And, Mr Speaker, his new NBN service is actually cheaper than his old internet service. While it's important to roll out the NBN in the areas where homes and businesses are most concentrated, it pleases me to say that there is also a strong focus to reach regional and remote areas. The government recognises the vital importance of communications to people living, working and travelling in regional and remote Australia. That is why we have committed to prioritising the NBN rollout to underserved areas where it is feasible to do so. The first satellite Sky Muster was launched in October 2015. Indeed, there are currently 885 premises eligible to order a satellite service in the Fisher electorate, where the standard service won't do the job. That is because connectivity in the form of the NBN or mobile coverage is an essential part of everyday life for emergencies, natural disasters, businesses, agriculture, public safety and for staying in touch with family and friends. There is more government investment going into regional communications infrastructure than at any time before. The second satellite, Sky Muster 2, successfully launched from French Guiana on the 6th of October providing additional capacity for the delivery of health and education services, as well as improving the productivity of agriculture and regional businesses. In contrast, despite being in government for 6 years, Labor did not spend a single dollar on improving mobile coverage in regional and remote Australia. The NBN rollout is further progressed in regional Australia than it is in metropolitan areas. All premises being served by satellite are now able to order a service, and nearly 70% of the fixed wireless network is ready for service. Every day, thousands of regional Australians, students, farmers, families and business owners are benefiting from these improved services. Mr Deputy Speaker, the NBN is on track to be available to half of all Australian premises, that's 5.4 million, by the end of June 2017, increasing to three-quarters of premises by the end of June 2018. To date, nearly two-thirds of all premises are in design, under construction or ready for service. 70% of premises are covered by the NBN today are in regional and non-metro areas. While there's no doubt that transitioning to a new technology can be difficult, the latest telecommunication industry ombudsman report clearly shows that NBN is getting better and managing new connections and working hard to address service complaints.
The discussion has concluded.